The agenda for this training session will include the following sections. The first part will provide an overview, as well as the objectives of the training, a background and regulatory overview, and a review of verification requirements. Following this, we will have a short answer question period where the department can respond to questions that come through the chat function. The second part of the training session will provide a review of the Alberta Greenhouse Gas Quantification Methodologies, or the AQM. There will be a second question and answer period and a break during this part of the presentation. Lastly, we will review areas that we've identified as being deficient or areas that need improvement in verifications conducted in Alberta. And we will end with a final question and answer period. We may not be able to address all of the questions that come through during the session, but please feel free to submit your questions to our main email address, which is aep.ghd@gov.ab.ca. This verification training is mandatory for lead verifiers and peer reviewers conducting verifications in Alberta for 2021. Specifically, this includes 2020 compliance reports, which are due June 30th, 2021, and benchmark applications submitted by September 1st, 2021. This training is not mandatory for verifications of emission offset project reports, but it is highly encouraged. If a lead verifier or peer reviewer is unable to complete the training during one of these live sessions, the department will be posting a recorded session online with an online quiz that would be completed by the person. While this training is not required for other members of the verification team, we do encourage all members who are involved in the verification to take the training. Alberta-specific training is aimed to cover regulatory requirements, Alberta sectors, risk areas, and lessons learned. We've based the training on our experience and review of verification reports and common areas where we have identified some deficiencies. Please note that the training is not meant to replace the ISO 14064-3 training requirement or the mandatory verifier qualifications that are specified in the regulation and Part 1 of the standard for validation, verification, and audit. Taking this training alone does not qualify you as a verifier or a verification company as a third-party assurance provider under the regulation. As mentioned previously, there will be opportunities for questions throughout the session. If there are any facility-specific questions that verifiers have, please do not hesitate to contact the department directly for guidance. Moving into 2022 and beyond, the department does intend to introduce more formalized online training, which may include a specific online training platform with training frequencies prescribed. And we are also considering posting a list of qualified verifiers that facilities and projects can access to make their selection for a verifier. We hope that this training will help to improve the verification process for both the verifier and the party being verified. We welcome any comments or suggestions following your attendance at the training. Please feel free to submit these to the general email address.
I'll now cover a background of the regulatory systems that have been in place in Alberta since 2007 to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from industrial facilities. From 2007 to 2017, the province implemented the specified gas emitters regulation. This was an intensity-based system that used facility-specific baselines to set reduction requirements. It was based on direct emissions exclusively. From 2018 and 2019, the province switched to the carbon competitiveness incentive regulation. This was an output-based system, also relying on greenhouse gas intensities, which used both assigned and established benchmarks for various products that are produced by regulated entities in Alberta. It also incorporated some accounting of indirect emissions or imports of emissions-intensive products such as electricity, hydrogen, and heat. Also during this time, the province had a provincial carbon levy, which was in place through 2018 and into June of 2019. We also introduced with this regulation the ability for facilities to opt in to the CCIR in order to reduce their costs relative to the provincial carbon levy. The CCIR, or Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation, has now been replaced by the Technology Innovation Emissions Reduction Regulation. So this has come into force as of January 1st, 2020, and it applies to facilities who've had annual emissions over 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in any year 2016 or subsequent. It also provides pathways, somewhat like the CCIR, to allow facilities to opt in or enter the regulation. So that can be through the action of opting in an individual site, or by forming an aggregate of conventional oil and gas facilities to become regulated under the Technology Innovation Emissions Reduction Regulation. So the regulatory scheme includes the concept of both high performance benchmarks for certain products, as well as facility specific benchmarks. So the high performance benchmark does not have a tightening or a year-over-year decline. And we currently have not established any high performance benchmark for the aggregated conventional oil and gas facilities. The facility-specific benchmark is set at typically 90% of historic emissions intensity. So it looks at historic emissions performance and applies a 10% reduction target. And all of our aggregated conventional oil and gas facilities will receive a facility-specific benchmark for the 2020 year. The facility-specific benchmark does also include a tightening concept for non-aggregate facilities. The regulated emissions which are covered under tier depend on whether you're a large emitter or an opted-in facility, or whether you've come in through aggregation as a collection of conventional oil and gas facilities. So for those sites that are regulated on the basis of having opted in their individual facility or being a large emitter, all direct emissions are subject to the regulation. For aggregates, the regulated emissions include only stationary fuel combustion. And in either case, those regulated emissions, direct emissions, do not include biomass carbon dioxide emissions, nor do they include emissions from federally levied fuels where the facility has a exemption certificate already in place. The regulation sets out and incorporates a number of standards as forming part of the regulation and forming part of the overall structure of the requirements of the program. So these include the standard for developing benchmarks, the standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports, the standard for validation, verification, and audit, the standard for greenhouse gas emissions offset project developers. And these standards are set out in two parts within each standard. The first part is the part that is incorporated into the regulation and legally binding on the facilities as essentially part of the regulation. The part two are non-legally binding requirements and essentially program guidance, which are provided to the various stakeholders in the different standards. Also, forming part of the system requirements and the references for verification is the Alberta quantification methodology. So this sets out the requirements of how to quantify, for example, emissions, production, or other quantities that are required under the regulatory scheme. And it's basically mandatory through its incorporation in the standard documents part 1. The standard for developing benchmarks actually covers a number of topics and might be a little bit broader than its name might imply. So it does include the methods and practices used in developing facility-specific benchmarks, as well as the high-performance benchmarks that are set out for specific products. It also discusses and sets out the way that indirects, self-generation of electricity, including cogeneration, are dealt with in the setting of benchmarks for facilities in various sectors. And it also discusses and deals with the entry into the regulation, for example, through the opt-in requirements, and sets out the criteria by which sites can opt into the regulation or form aggregates and come into the regulation if they have multiple conventional oil and gas facilities. It also sets out the rules and requirements for receiving a cost containment designation and the subsequent reporting and benefits of that cost containment program. The standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports really is specific to preparing those two report types for the department. So that's the annual compliance report, which is required by all regulated facilities that have annual compliance reporting obligation, as well as the forecasting reports, which are required only by, I guess, the very largest emitters under the program. So this standard also sets out the methodology are applicable to the facilities that are covered under the regulation. The next standard, the standard for validation, verification, and audit, basically is in large part the centerpiece of the training which we're covering today. So this sets out the requirements for third-party assurance providers, validators and verifiers, as well as auditors. So again, the focus of this training is on verification of compliance reports, verification of benchmark applications, data submissions, or emissions offset project reports, and that's the main focus of this standard. Validation and audit requirements that are set out to support the cost containment program, as well as the verification of the specific reports that are supplied as part of the cost containment designation, are also covered in the standard, but we don't cover those in depth as part of this particular training. The last standard I'll mention is the standard for greenhouse gas emissions offset project developers. So this really sets out the requirements for developing and submitting for credit emissions offset projects that you can develop and put forward under the tier regulation. In addition to the standard, different offset project types will also have offset protocols which need to be followed as part of creating such a project. So I'll talk a little bit about the types of submissions that are required under the regulation. and that are subject to the verification activity. So under the new tier regulation, verified annual compliance reports need to be submitted to the department by June 30th of each year, covering the prior calendar year. So the first compliance reporting deadline we have covers the 2020 calendar year and needs to be submitted to the department by June 30th, 2021. And those compliance reports need to be verified, and the verification report needs to be supplied along with the compliance report. Each of the compliance reports need to have a positive verification opinion, so that any material errors need to be resolved before the compliance report is submitted and the facility is considered in compliance with the regulation. The forecasting reports that some of the largest facilities need to submit to the department do not require third-party verification. And there is a difference, I guess, in the compliance reporting form and the required data that has to come into the department, depending on whether you're an aggregation of conventional oil and gas facilities or whether you're a large emitter or opted-in facility. So that those differences are reflected in the reports themselves. So benchmark applications may also be required to be submitted by facilities in order for the department to set a facility-specific benchmark, or in some cases to support the development of a high-performance benchmark by the department. So these reports typically cover a 3-year period, although not necessarily in all cases, but typically cover a 3-year period where the default years are 2013 through 2015. There is director discretion to include periods outside of 2013 to 2015, depending on the situation of the facility. We've taken a different approach for aggregates as we've started the tier program, and also facilities that are newly opted into the regulation typically will benchmark on the 3 most recent years. So in conducting the verification, the materiality needs to be assessed for all the benchmark years. And there are also some parameters that are submitted as part of benchmarking, which aren't normally part of the annual compliance reporting. And so this would include, for example, data reported having to do with self-generation of electricity and the emissions associated with the self-generation of electricity. The department also from time to time requires additional data or further data to be submitted to support a particular compliance period or a particular request, and we may require those data submissions to be third-party verified. So typically when this is done, a focused verification may be required, covering the scope of the particular data that's been requested to be submitted to the department. In most cases, this kind of engagement wouldn't require a site visit. And where we're asking for a limited scope verification, the department will often specify the scope and the parameters to examine as part of the verification work. In addition, those sites that have received a cost containment designation do have to submit annually emissions reduction project report. And both verification and validation requirements apply at different times, I guess, to the emissions reduction plan and the emission reduction plan report. So those folks who have developed emission offset projects also from time to time, often on an annual basis, will submit an emission offset project report. The timing of that submission is determined by the project developer, and the report, as well as the verification, are required documents before the registry will issue any emissions offset for the project. So the offset project report documents the current period being put forward and the current claim for offsets. It also speaks to how the project was conducted during that time, and if there were any, it would include a discussion of any variances, and those variances would need to be reviewed as part of the verification. Site visit requirements exist also for the verification of emission offset project reports for each report period that's submitted. And again, the verifier must submit a separate report for each period that's being put forward by the offset project. And again, those periods don't necessarily have to be annual periods. It's up to the project developer what time intervals they wish to cover in their emission offset report. To be accepted by the registry, the emissions offset project report does have to receive a positive verification opinion. So again, any material errors must be resolved before the submission of the report to the registry.
So compliance reports and benchmark applications must be verified before submission. There are certain circumstances that may allow for an extension of the verification of a benchmark application. In these cases, the verifier and the facility must approach the department to discuss any extension requests. Emission offset project reports must be verified before an emission offset claim is submitted to the registry for serialization. And all verifications must be conducted to a reasonable level of assurance, and a positive opinion is required. Qualified opinions are typically assessed by the department on a case-by-case basis, which may require some follow-up with the facility and verifier. Verifiers may conduct verifications for a regulated facility for 5 consecutive years, followed by a 2-year break. This is described in Part 1 of the Standard for Validation, Verification, and Audit, Section 5D. The verifier in this case includes the verification company itself and any verification team member. So for example, if a particular verification company has conducted verifications for a facility for 5 consecutive years, then this verification company, regardless of the team members on the verification team, would have to take a 2-year break. In another example, if a verification team member was performing a verification for a facility in 1 year and then proceeds to conduct another verification for the same facility in the subsequent year, but under a different verification company, this would be included in the counting of the 5 consecutive years. The counting of consecutive years do not include verifications of benchmark applications. This is due to the fact that benchmark applications typically consist of 3 years of data and can be variable, and therefore challenging to include in the counting of consecutive years. If there is concern, though, or uncertainty around the counting of consecutive years that are allowed, the verifier and or the facility are encouraged to contact the department for a determination. Similarly, verifiers may conduct verifications of emission offset project reports for 5 consecutive reporting periods, followed by a 2 reporting period break. Note that a reporting period is not always an annual period. There could be multiple reporting periods within a year, and this is the primary difference between assessing consecutive verifications between verifications of emission offset project reports versus compliance reports. So site visits are a required component of verifications unless it is authorized otherwise by the director. This includes verifications of annual compliance reports and benchmark applications. As well, offset projects require a site visit for each reporting period as part of the verification. Again, for emission offset projects, a reporting period is not necessarily an annual period. Verifiers may submit a request to the director to waive a site visit if it's believed to be appropriate. The request will be reviewed and a determination will be provided back to the verifier. Most recently, due to COVID-19, our department reassessed the site visit requirement and evaluated the option to allow verifiers to conduct remote or virtual site visits in lieu of physical site visits. Given the impact of COVID-19, the director has granted authorization to allow verifiers to conduct virtual site visits for verifications of 2020 compliance reports due June 30th, 2021, benchmark applications submitted by September 1st of 2021, and also emission offset project reports that are submitted before September 1st, 2021. This is a temporary measure, and as a department, we will evaluate further whether remote site visits may be an option for verifiers beyond this period that is impacted by COVID. So based on a list of verifiers, the director has issued letters providing this authorization. If you are a verifier that intends to perform verifications in Alberta, covering this period and would like authorization to conduct virtual site visit and haven't received a letter yet from the director, please feel free to contact the department to make this request. So what are virtual site visits? These are site visits that are conducted remotely using information and communication technologies. Site visits described in the standard for validation, verification, and audit typically refers to physical on-site visits where verifiers are expected to conduct inspections at the facility or project in person. Remote site visits are not typical for greenhouse gas verifications unless it's warranted by health and safety or site access issues. So this approach is relatively new for verifiers, and we want to ensure that the risks associated with conducting virtual site visits are adequately addressed. So we have updated the verification standard to provide some requirements and guidance around conducting virtual site visits. So the following are some highlights from this section in the standard. Again, please review this section to ensure that you are meeting the requirements for conducting a virtual site visit. So the first requirement is for the verifier to apply the International Accreditation Forum, or IAF, mandatory document for the use of information and communication technologies for auditing and assessment purposes. As well, we understand that various accreditation bodies have issued guidance materials that also can be utilized by verifiers to conduct virtual site visits. One of the key items prior to initiating a virtual site visit is to clearly identify what the risks are from not conducting the site visit by being physically at the facility or project, and how you intend to address these risks through verification procedures. These should be outlined in the verification plan. We do recommend that verifiers confirm the ICT that will be used for the site visit. So for example, if video conferencing is going to be used, what platform will be used by both parties? Will there be adequate internet connection at the facility, et cetera? And also the verifier should consider developing a contingency plan should there be any technology failures that occur during the site visit. Finally, we do ask verifiers to provide specific findings from the performance of the virtual site visit. highlighting issues that might have occurred and how they were resolved. And again, the department will continue to assess whether virtual site visits may continue as a potential option for verifiers past this period that is impacted by COVID. Records and information. So very often the department will request additional information from the verifier, the facility, or project developers on verifications that were performed. Under Part 1 of the standard, working papers, peer review documentation, and evidence of qualifications and experience of the lead verifier and peer reviewer may be requested. And records or information related to a verification, including working papers, must be retained for at least 7 years after the date on which the records are or information is created. Verifier qualifications. So in order to perform verifications under tier, the verifier must meet certain eligibility criteria, which are outlined in the regulation and as well under Part 1 of the Standard for Validation, Verification, and Audit. First, a point of clarification. Under the regulation, a third-party assurance provider refers to verifiers and validators who conduct verifications and validations respectively under the regulation. In this presentation, as we're presenting training for verifications, we will use the terminology verifier. So under tier, a person is eligible to be a verifier if the person is a verification body accredited to ISO 14065 2013 by a member of the International Accreditation Forum, and the person has any other qualifications that are specified by the director. So for example, the director has specified that verifiers must complete this verification training for verifications conducted in 2021. It should also be noted that a person under the regulation refers to an individual or an organization. So when we speak of a verification body, that would obviously refer to the verification company that is accredited. If the verifier is not accredited, per the above, the verifier is still eligible to conduct verifications in Alberta up until June 30, 2023, if the person has technical knowledge of quantification methodologies and verification practices, and an accounting or engineering designation. So in addition to the requirements under tier, there are mandatory requirements outlined in Part 1 of the Standard for Validation, Verification, and Audit. Specifically, there are qualifications for the designated signing authority, lead verifier, and peer reviewer. The designated signing authority, or DSA, is someone who has signing authority on behalf of the employer, which is the verification company. This person isn't required to have the same experience or qualifications as the lead verifier or peer reviewer, but we do expect them to have some basic understanding of the verification process. As well, the DSA can be the same person as the lead verifier. There are contraventions that are outlined in the regulation, which are considered to be offensive. The following is not a complete list of these contraventions, but a few that pertains to verification specifically. So the first being that the third-party assurance provider must follow the Standard for Validation, Verification, and Audit when verifying compliance reports, benchmark applications, emission offset project reports, and cost containment applications. As well, it is offense for a facility and third-party assurance provider if a third-party assurance provider conducting a verification does not meet some of these qualification requirements that we're speaking of. So we do encourage verifiers to review this part of the regulation prior to engaging in any verification work. The lead verifier and peer reviewer are subject to additional experience and qualification requirements. This includes having successfully completed the ISO 14064-3 training, a minimum of 4 years of experience in verification, whether it's from compliance and or emission offsets verifications, technical knowledge of the quantification of production, fuel usages, imported indirects such as heat, electricity, or hydrogen, carbon dioxide sequestration, reductions of specified gases being verified, process operations and production. The verifier is also required to attest to these qualifications in the statement of qualification, which is included in the verification report. Now we're going to jump into an overview of the verification process itself. This will hopefully be a review for verifiers, as these are core elements in a verification process. Throughout this section, we will highlight some key points as it relates to verifications conducted in Alberta. We've also broken down the process into 5 main areas, including initiation, planning and approach, execution, data review and evaluation, and conclusions. So the first step is to conduct a conflict of interest assessment prior to initiating a verification engagement. Conflicts may be real or perceived, and it is the responsibility of the lead verifier to determine whether conflicts identified will either prevent them from initiating a verification, or if the conflicts identified can be managed through a mitigation plan. The verifier may submit a mitigation plan to the department for review and determination if there are any particular concerns on potential conflicts that were identified. Following the completion of the conflict of interest assessment, the verifier may execute an agreement or contract with the facility or project. These contracts are between the verifier and the facility or project, and not with the department. So if there are issues identified with the verification, the department will typically contact the facility or the project developer directly, and then they will have to communicate these issues regarding the verification with the verifier. In cases where there are mandatory requirements that are not met specifically by the verifier, the department will reach out to both the facility or project and the verifier. Again, it is the responsibility of the facility and the verifier to enter into an agreement that would meet the requirements of the regulation. As part of the initiation process, it is important to clearly define what the verification objective, scope, and criteria to ensure that the regulatory requirements for the verification are going to be met. A key point in developing the verification scope is that the facility or project assertion includes all of the data and values that are reported and the data that contributes to the compliance outcome, and not just the emissions. Choosing the right verification team members for the verification is also a critical step to ensure the success of the verification. And we do encourage verifiers to use technical experts where needed who can contribute to the verification process. Typically, the first step in the planning approach, which would be to have a kickoff call with the facility or project developer team members. This again is to ensure that both parties understand the scope, objectives, and the criteria of the verification. Following this, the verifier will develop a verification plan that consists of, but is not limited to, verification procedures, a risk assessment, and sampling plan. Typically, the verifier would request for an initial set of information and data and conduct an initial desktop review and start the working papers. This is all to help develop the verification plan. In the diagram here, we want to emphasize that the design of the verification procedures and the size of data sampling needs to mitigate and correlate with the verification risks that are identified. A verification plan is not meant to be static and should be modified throughout the verification process to address any new information or data that is being provided. We do caution the use of verification plan templates without evaluating specific risks for the facility and or project that the verification is being conducted for. Very often we see generic risk assessments that are not detailed enough and in some cases incorrect. Please take the time to conduct a detailed risk assessment in order to properly design the verification procedures and the necessary data sampling to mitigate all of the verification risks. The execution of procedures include collecting and reviewing data and information provided by the facility or project, as well as continual reassessment of the risk and verification procedures and sampling throughout the verification process. As part of the execution of procedures, the verifier will also conduct a site visit. And as discussed earlier, site visits in the standard refers to physical on-site visits. And with the impacts of COVID-19, the director has provided authorization for virtual site visits for 2021. And again, if you have not received a letter providing this authorization, please do contact the department. The purpose of the site visit is to conduct an inspection of the facility boundaries, operations, sources, and processes. As well, the verifier would have the opportunity to interview site personnel and facility or project team members responsible for data collection and calculations used in an assertion. We do encourage verifiers to be prepared before conducting a site visit, and please ensure that the facility or project is provided a verification plan at least 24 hours before conducting the site visit, so that the facility or project team members have the opportunity to review and be prepared to provide the additional information and data that is requested. The working papers are a critical component of the verification process, and it essentially documents that process. It typically contains the supporting information and data that's provided by the facility or project, as well as analysis that's conducted by the verifier, such as recalculations, trending analysis, error assessments, and materiality calculations. Throughout the verification process, the verifier would be identifying findings and issues. The verifier must communicate with the facility or project on these issues and allow the facility or project to make corrections to their assertions, especially in cases where there are significant or material errors identified. Once issues are resolved, the verifier can reevaluate the corrections and updated assertion and will ultimately provide a final opinion on the verification. These issues that are resolved and unresolved should be documented and summarized, and this could be an issues log that the verifier maintains. The verifier is also required to assess the errors identified in a verification against the material threshold that is established in the Standard for Validation, Verification, and Audit. Substantive testing that includes collecting and analyzing data and evidence from the facility or project developer is a required component in order to assess materiality. For verifications of compliance reports and benchmark applications, a material error is defined as the total error calculated in accordance with equation 5-8 of section 5.1.1 of part 2. That exceeds 5% for a facility with total regulated emissions less than 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and allowable emissions less than 500,000 tons of CO2e for the reporting period being verified, or 2% for a facility with total regulated emissions equal to or greater than 500 tons of CO2e for the reporting period being verified. For verifications of emission offset project reports, the total error is considered to be material if it exceeds 5% for an emission offset project that generates less than 500,000 tons of CO2e of emission offsets per year, or 2% for an emission offset project that generates equal to or greater than 500 tons CO2e of emission offsets per year. The total error is calculated using equation 5-8 in section 5.1.1 of part 2 of the standard. Please note that this equation is used specifically for verifications of compliance reports and benchmark applications. It's not used for assessing the total error for emission offset project reports. This equation essentially is summing up the discrete errors that are identified with individual parameters that are used to calculate the total regulated emissions or allowable emissions for a facility. Unlike under SGER, indirects are included in the calculation of the facility's compliance obligation, and therefore the total error calculation must include potential errors that are identified with indirects. The equation sums the absolute errors of each discrete error. So to not allow for the errors to cancel each other out. As well, you'll notice that in calculating the total error, errors that are associated with the production or indirects are normalized back to tons of CO2e by applying the appropriate benchmark. Once the discrete errors are summed up, it is divided by the higher of the total regulated emissions or allowable emissions. As discussed earlier, the department mostly relies on quantitative analysis to determine whether there are any material errors in an assertion. We recognize that qualitative findings that may lead to a material error or a negative opinion are more challenging for verifiers to come to determine and challenging for facilities to resolve. So examples of qualitative findings that could result in a negative verification opinion includes a lack of documentation or evidence to support the assertion, or high risk for a material error based on sensitivity analysis that may have been conducted, and non-confidence in the data management system that was used for an emission offset project. Once the verification process is completed and the verifier is confident in providing a conclusion and opinion, the verifier may prepare a verification report and statement of verification, or SOV. Please ensure that the statement provided is consistent in the verification report and the SOV. There have been instances where the verification statements are different in the verification report and SOV, and therefore requiring further follow-up by the department. Also, please ensure that the statement is clear and concise and reflects the verification that was completed. So an example wording would be, based on the verification conducted by verifier ABC, the assertion prepared by facility XYZ was determined to be free of material misstatements, fairly represented, substantiated by sufficient and appropriate evidence, and was prepared in accordance with the technology innovation and emissions reduction regulation and all relevant criteria. Examples of verification statements that are not acceptable includes positive, or the assertion is materially correct. The use of the prescribed verification report template is required. Please ensure that you're using the correct template for the verification that you're conducting. The top link here is for verification of compliance reports, benchmark applications, and data submissions that are submitted. The second link provided is used for verifications of emission offset project reports. The verification report template includes the sections and information that we want verifiers to provide in the report. These templates can be easily edited to provide flexibility for verifiers to add sections. As well, additional appendices may be added if needed, but please do not remove sections, as these are requirements for the verification report. Please also provide the final verification plan with the final risk assessment and sampling plan in the report, and be specific on what verification procedures were conducted and the type of data and evidence that were reviewed. Here we want to highlight a few sections of the verification report that's critical for our department's review of the verifications that are submitted. We do request that verifiers provide a summary of the significant or material findings in the body of the verification report. So this includes a high-level description of the finding and why it is significant, including the quantitative error associated with the finding, a description of source areas, how were these findings identified and resolved, the specific criteria that was not met, an explanation of how the criteria was not met, and an evidence used for this finding. Please try to keep this description pretty concise in a few sentences. While the high-level description is provided in the body of the verification report, we would like to see a more detailed list of findings and issues in the appendix. This may be the issues log that is used for verifiers to track the interactions that the verifier has with the facility or project developer. So this could include data requests, issues that were identified and resolved. And generally, we would like to see a little bit more explanation in the findings in this section. And then ultimately, the results from the performance of the verification procedures by the verifier. There is a section in the verification report template called Opportunities for Improvement. This section is intended for verification reports that are used for government re-verifications. As the verifier is contracted with the department to conduct the verification and not with the facility or project developer, they may provide recommendations to the department for improvements that can be made to a facility or project assertion. For other types of verifications, this section is not expected to be completed, as it could be considered as consulting and may present a conflict for the verification. Please also ensure that all of the forms have been completed and signed, and that includes the conflict of interest form, statement of qualification, and statement of verification. Finally, we are implementing a new requirement where we'd like to request the verification reports to be submitted in both PDF and Word format. We will consider the PDF version to be the final version of the report, especially if there are discrepancies identified between the two versions. So please do ensure that both documents are consistent before submitting. The main purpose of the Word file is to assist in our internal automated review process. Okay, now we want to just discuss a little bit about verification requirements for aggregate facilities. As we mentioned earlier, aggregate facilities are a new type of regulated facility under our industrial greenhouse gas regulatory system and are treated differently under the regulation compared with other regulated facilities. Therefore, we want to spend a little bit of time to discuss the requirements specifically for the verification of aggregate facility submissions. We have updated the standard for validation, verification, and audit to include some requirements and guidance in section 8.1. We'll highlight some of these requirements here. So aggregate facilities are comprised of more than one conventional oil and gas site, or COG as we call it, but they are treated as one facility. Therefore, the expectation is that one verification is performed for the aggregate facility, which would include one verification plan and verification report and one set of signed forms. For the verification of an aggregate facility, the verifier should confirm that the sites within the aggregate facility does meet the definition of a COG under the regulation, assess whether the facility's method to compile the XYZ or XY coordinates for the COGs is reasonable, conduct a review of the boundary files for the sites that have emissions greater than 10,000 tons of CO2e, assess the data for all COGs that have been included in the assertion, assess whether Chapter 15 quantification methodologies were followed, and review source data such as Petronex and third-party invoices used for the facility's assertion. As well, the verifier should ensure that only stationary fuel combustion emissions are included in the assertion. So this would exclude flaring and venting emissions. In terms of site visits for an aggregate facility, the expectation is not for the verifier to conduct a site visit at every cog in the aggregate facility. The verifier may use a risk-based approach to determine which facilities to be visited, and we encourage the selection of different types of cogs to conduct visits at, recognizing that the selection must be appropriate per the risk assessment that is conducted. We also require that the verifier conduct a site visit at where the data is managed for the aggregate facility. And again, virtual site visits are allowed for aggregate facility verifications in 2021 per the director's authorization. Okay, moving into verification of benchmark applications. The verifier is required to confirm that an opted-in facility has been approved to opt in to the regulation, confirm whether products that facility is seeking facility-specific benchmarks for are eligible to receive a benchmark under tier and the benchmark standard, confirm whether the emissions production, imports and exports, and other data are correctly represented within the facility's boundaries and boundary file, calculate the total error for each year of information that is provided in the benchmark application in order to assess materiality. And for multi-product facilities, review the emission splits, imported and exported indirects between products, and indicate whether the facility's methodology is reasonable. Benchmark applications may also contain data or calculated values that were not previously reported or subject to mandatory quantification methodologies. So the verification requirements for previously reported and verified data under SGER or CCIR includes confirming that the data and calculated values in the benchmark application matches those reported in the SGER or CCIR compliance reports. The department may request reevaluation of previously reported data if there are significant deviations detected in the quantification methodologies that were applied. The verification requirements for data not previously reported includes confirming whether data is consistent with quantification methodologies prescribed in the Alberta greenhouse gas quantification methodologies, and if not, confirming whether a deviation request was granted for any sources. And also confirming whether the quantification methodology applied is conservative. As mentioned earlier, occasionally verifications of a portion of a compliance report, benchmark application, or data submission may be requested by the department. We refer to these as focus verifications. For these types of verifications, the verification procedures are tailored to address the specific portions of the submission that requires verification. So typically, re-verification of previously reported or verified data that is unchanged would not be required. So for example, a facility has updated the imported heat data in their compliance report. The update in the heat data report resulted in a material change in the facility assertion. So the department requested a focus verification specifically on the updated heat data only and would not require any further verification on the previously reported data that remained unchanged. And the department typically does issue a director's letter requesting focus verifications and outlining some specific requirements. And as well, the department may request to review the verification and sampling plan before the initiation of focus verifications. For focus verifications, we do request that the verifier calculates the total error just for the parts of the submission being verified In other words, the verifier does not need to include other errors that may have been identified for other parts of the submission in previous verifications. This is a modified total error that would form the basis of the verifier's opinion. Please note, however, that the department will assess the total error fully based on the errors identified in the focus verification and in previous verifications in order to fully assess the materiality. Site visit requirements will be requested on a case-by-case basis at the discretion of the director, but it typically isn't required for focus verifications. As focus verifications are different, we do encourage verifiers to contact the department or compliance reviewer of the facility if clarification is needed on the scope. Re-verifications are conducted by the department on approximately 10 to 15% of submissions, which include both compliance reports and emission offset project reports. Facilities and projects are selected based on a risk-based approach and a random selection process. The department establishes master agreements with verifiers and issues statements of work for annual re-verifications to be conducted. Generally, the process would follow the verification standard with some specific focuses on individual facilities and projects, which the department communicates with the selected verifiers for the work. We do anticipate initiating the 2019 re-verifications in 2021, and more information will be coming on that from the department. We want to spend a little bit of time to discuss what we believe are potential drivers in missed verification findings or deficiencies in verification processes. Here we have a table outlining some of the potential drivers that we've observed in the past and the occurrence and impacts of these drivers. So this includes lack of experience or familiarity with a particular facility or sector. Although the occurrence of this is low, the impact is fairly large in terms of the quality of the verification that is conducted. Lack of understanding the verification scope, potential underpricing of the verification work, which could be linked to the previous point of not fully understanding the verification scope, or it may be based on market drivers that are causing the underpricing of the verification work. Also, the lack of understanding of regulatory requirements. This is fairly understandable given the frequency of changes in the regulatory regimes over the past 4 years. This is one of the reasons why the department is trying to find ways to better communicate the regulatory requirements, such as with this verification training. Deficiencies in verification planning and procedures could also be linked to several of the other drivers listed above, such as underpricing or lack of understanding in the verification scope. And lastly, complacency that could be caused by overfamiliarity with the facility and processes that the verification is being conducted for. This is a risk that we try to mitigate by reducing the number of consecutive verifications that can be conducted by a verifier, which was discussed earlier. So when deficiencies do occur in verifications, it does impact everyone, including the department, the verifier, and the facility and project. So for the department, this means that more resources and time would be required to address issues with verifications or issues with submissions from facilities or projects. We would have to develop, implement, and enforce follow-up actions in order to address these deficiencies. And as well, we would have to address the impacts of potentially missed material findings in a facility or project assertion. For the verifier, often it means they may have to conduct re-verifications or additional follow-up actions on verifications with little or no budget. There may be mandatory requirements for verifiers under the regulation and standard that were not met. And so the verifier may be faced with enforcement action from the department or from their accreditation body. And lastly, there is a potential of losing clients due to poor performance in a particular verification. Finally, for the facility or the project, more resources and costs would be needed for the facility or project to address any errors that were potentially missed by the verification. There may be a requirement to resubmit or re-verify using a new verifier, which would result in additional cost to the facility or project. The facility may be subject to additional compliance obligation that again was missed. And then lastly, there is a potential for the removal or cancellation of emission offsets or emission performance credits. The last couple of slides were meant to highlight the importance of understanding the requirements and expectations for verifications conducted under this regulation. So by improving the quality of verifications, we will reduce the risks for all parties in dealing with the potential consequences related to verification issues. In this part of the training, we want to provide a comprehensive overview of the Alberta greenhouse gas quantification methodologies. This includes a review of the objectives of the AQM, overview of the mandatory quantification methodologies for the 2020 reporting period, a description of the level classifications for methods prescribed under tier. Note that we have adjusted the terminology from tier classification, which was previously used under the CCIR, to level classifications under tier. We will also review data requirements and deficiencies that have been identified in data management systems and areas that are commonly missed or deficient in verifications. The objectives of the AQM are to provide a consistent and standardized approach to quantify emissions, production, and other reported parameters, provide level playing field for facilities within the same sector and across all sectors, standardized benchmarking approaches for regulated facilities, and align with federal greenhouse gas reporting programs where it is appropriate. The mandatory quantification methodologies for the 2020 reporting period includes Chapter 1, stationary fuel combustion, Chapter 4, venting, Chapter 5, on-site transportation, Chapter 8, industrial processes, Chapter 12, imports, Chapter 13, production, Chapter 14, carbon dioxide emissions from combustion of biomass, Chapter 15, aggregate facilities, Chapter 16, cogeneration benchmark calculation, and Chapter 17, measurements, sampling, analysis, and data management. The following appendices provide additional information and mandatory requirements that are referenced by the chapters noted in the previous slide. This includes Appendix A, references, Appendix B, field properties, Appendix C, general calculation instructions, Appendix D, conversion factors, and Appendix E, additional information for the Alberta Gas Processing Index. Facilities may submit deviation requests to the department for mandatory requirements that the facility is unable to meet. The facility may propose an alternative and conservative method in place of the mandatory requirement. The department will then review and provide a time-limited approval to the facility if the deviation request is accepted. Please note that deviations are approved for a period of up to 1 year and are not intended to be permanent approvals for deviations. The expectation is that the facility will eventually meet the mandatory requirement. We want to provide an update on the status of upcoming chapters that are anticipated to be posted in 2021. A draft of Chapter 2 flaring is anticipated to be posted soon, but the methodologies will not be mandatory for the 2020 reporting period. There will be opportunities for stakeholders to provide comments on the chapter before it is finalized. A draft of Chapter 3 fugitives is also anticipated to be posted later in 2021. Finally, we have made the decision to remove formation CO2 as a separate source category for reporting. Therefore, Chapter 10, Formation CO2, will be removed from the AQM. This does not mean that CO2 entrained in fuels and feeds are excluded from reporting or in the direct emissions. Instead, these emissions will be reported as an emission under different source categories. For example, CO2 that is emitted by venting would be reported under the venting category. Now we want to provide an overview of mandatory quantification methodologies that are covered in various chapters, starting with stationary fuel combustion emissions, which are presented in Chapter 1. In this slide, we want to show a distribution of emissions by source category and emissions type. Not surprisingly, the majority of emissions, approximately 87% of emissions from regulated facilities, are from stationary fuel combustion emissions. This is the main reason why we place a lot of emphasis on the accuracy of emissions from stationary fuel combustion. As you can see in the smaller graph, the CO2 emissions are the predominant greenhouse gas that is emitted from stationary fuel combustion. Here is another figure that shows the distribution of emissions by sector and source category. With the exception of a few sectors, stationary fuel combustion emissions represent the majority of emissions from facilities in most sectors. In this slide, this is another illustration showing that the predominant greenhouse gas that is emitted is CO2 in most sectors from stationary fuel combustion. Levels for tier regulated facilities are provided in the standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports. As mentioned earlier, we have changed the terminology from tier classification under CCIR to level classification under tier. Functionally, these are the same, but we didn't want any confusion in terminology as our regulation is also called tier. Typically in the AQM, methodologies that are classified as level 3 may be used for CO2 emissions quantification, while methodologies that are classified as level 2 may be used for methane and nitrous oxide emissions quantification. Facilities are allowed to use a method that is higher than the minimum level classification that is prescribed for the particular greenhouse gas. The AQM also provides methodologies for facilities that are regulated under the specified gas reporting regulation. The levels for these regulated facilities are provided in the specified gas reporting standard. There has been some changes in the level classifications between methodologies prescribed under CCIR for the 2018 and 2019 reporting years versus tier, which is for 2020 and beyond. The main difference is the change in level classification for the SEMS method, which is method 1-5 in the AQM. Previously, this was a method that was identified as level 4 under CCIR, but we have changed it to level 3A, meaning that it is a method that is only available when a facility is unable to apply a level 3 method. The reason for this change is because of the limitations in the accuracy of emissions quantification using SEMS. In the next few slides, we will provide a quick overview of the methods in this chapter. We'll present in these slides what the methods are applicable for, the equations, and requirements for the method. Please do take the time to review these methods in the AQM in detail before initiating any verifications. Method 1-1 is a method for the quantification of CO2 from the combustion of non-variable fuels, which includes fuels like diesel, gasoline, and propane. This method allows for the application of default emission factors because the expectation is that the carbon content is relatively stable for these types of fuels. Therefore, this method can be used under any level classification. In the following slides, we've also included some highlighted sections to indicate areas where we have identified deficiencies in the verification process. The red highlighted items indicate areas where we have found a high level of deficiencies, whereas the orange highlighted items indicate a medium level of deficiencies identified. Method 1-2 is the high heating value correlation method that was adapted from the Federal Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. This is a method that is exclusively used by SGRR reporters or reporters for the GHGRP, and not for regulated facilities under tier. It is a correlation method that is based on the high heating value of the natural gas or fuel that is being consumed by the facility. Method 1-3 is a level 3 method that is used by regulated facilities under tier. This is a method for the combustion of variable fuels, meaning that the carbon content is variable and requires actual measurements. Typically, these carbon content or gas composition analysis are supplied by a third party or measured by the facility. It is the responsibility of the verifier to review this documentation as part of the verification process. The measurement frequency is dependent on the type of fuel that is being consumed, and these are presented in Table 17-1. We want to emphasize again the importance of ensuring the accuracy of the data that is being collected and used for this methodology, as again, stationary fuel combustion emissions represent a significant portion of emissions from regulated facilities. Method 1-4 is a new method that is introduced that allows a facility to use a mass balance approach to calculate the amount of carbon in the fuel that is combusted. In order to use this method, the facility must know the total carbon that is being supplied to the facility based on custody transfer or third-party documentation. As well, there can only be one unknown variable in the mass balance. For example, if a supply of natural gas to the facility is either being used as a feed for an industrial process and fuel for combustion, if the facility has an accurate measurement of the feed for the industrial process and carbon content measurement, the facility can use this mass balance approach to then calculate the carbon that remains that would be combusted. Currently, this method does not allow carbon in vented emissions or fugitive emissions to be included in the mass balance. Method 1-5 is the Continuous Emissions Monitoring Systems, or CEMS method. Again, this is a method that is classified as level 3A. This is a method that is used based on the measurements of CO2 or measurements of O2 to quantify CO2 emissions. As discussed previously, based on further review by the department, the level classification was adjusted from level 4 to level 3A. This means that this method can only be used if a regulated facility is unable to apply a level 3 method. The decision was made because it is believed that there are limitations in the accuracy of applying CEMS to quantify CO2 emissions. Now we are going to review the level classification and methods used for methane and nitrous oxide from stationary fuel combustion. There has been a change in level classification of methodologies from CCIR to tier. Under tier, emission factors, whether sector-based or technology-based, may be used for any level classification. The quantification of methane and nitrous oxide from stationary fuel combustion relies on the use of emission factors that are available for different types of fuels that are combusted and technologies that are used. These emission factors are provided in tables 1-2 to 1-7. A summary of these tables are provided in this slide. The facility must select the appropriate emission factors for the fuel that's being consumed and the technologies that are being used at the facility. The verifier is required to assess whether the emission factors applied are appropriate. The CEMS method, which is identified as method 1-7, may be used for methane or nitrous oxide quantification instead of using a method based on the default emission factors. Unlike stationary fuel combustion emissions, venting emissions represent a much smaller percent of regulated emissions. These emissions are predominantly from the upstream oil and gas sector and the pipeline transmission sector. Venting emissions consist mainly of methane and CO2 emissions. It is noted again that the minimum level classification for methane quantification is 2, while the level classification for CO2 is 3. Venting methodologies for methane and CO2 are typically the same, so the methodologies presented in this chapter are generally acceptable for the use under levels 2 and 3. Again, CO2 entrained in the field was previously classified as formation CO2. We have removed formation CO2 as an individual source category. However, these emissions would then have to be reported under the venting category if CO2 is being vented. Quantification methodologies for the following processes are prescribed in this chapter: produced gas and UOG facility methodologies, solid desiccant dehydrators, pigging and purges, atmospheric liquid storage tanks, pneumatic controls and pumps, compressor seals, glycol dehydrator, glycol refrigeration, acid gas removal and sulfur recovery units, hydrocarbon liquid unloading and loading, oil water separators, produced water venting, well test completion and workovers, process system blowdowns, gas well liquid unloading, and engine and turbine startups. Typical requirements for methodologies in this chapter includes measurements of gas compositions using methods that are prescribed by AER directives or analytical methods that are prescribed in Chapter 17. Quarterly sampling frequency is typically prescribed if it's not prescribed specifically for a particular method. Facilities may also use fuel gas composition if it is representative of the vented gas. Facilities should follow meter installation, calibrations, vent rate measurement, and vapor composition sampling frequencies that are prescribed by AER directives, and non-UOG facilities may follow industry best practices. And volume measurements must be adjusted to standard conditions as defined in Appendix C. Generally, the same methods and equations for the quantification of emissions from on-site transportation are the same as for stationary fuel combustion. Typically, CO2 emissions are based on gas compositions, or for non-variable fuels such as gasoline or diesel, default emission factors may be used. And methane and nitrous oxide emission factors are based on emission factors from the 2018 National Inventory Report. TIER does not intend to double price fuels. If fuels have already been subject to a levy, these emissions do not need to be reported or included in the total regulated emissions. For most facilities, transportation emissions are negligible. So a facility may apply an alternative and conservative methodology to estimate these emissions if they are deemed to be negligible. Earlier, we presented some figures that provide a distribution of emissions based on emission types and sectors that are regulated. Stationary fuel combustion emissions represent the largest portion of emissions. Second to stationary fuel combustion emissions are the industrial process emissions, which represents about 6% of emissions from regulated facilities. As you can see in this table, there are a few sectors that emit industrial process emissions, including chemicals, fertilizers, metals, minerals, and oil sand sectors. In the next few slides, we'll review briefly the different methods that are used to quantify industrial process emissions, which includes both carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. Also, it should be noted that many of the methods prescribed in this chapter are not assigned a level classification. If there are no level classifications assigned to a method, the method can be applied for any level classification. Hydrogen production generates industrial process CO2 emissions. from operations like steam methane reforming. Methods that are used to estimate these emissions include a direct feed oxidation method, CO2 mass balance by using the amount of raw unpurified hydrogen stream and the CO2 in the feed, hydrogen feed calculation method, and CO2 emissions from a mass balance approach that is based on the carbon content in the fuels and feeds that are used at the facility. CO2 that is consumed in urea production is a parameter that is included in the calculation of the total regulated emissions. The reason for the inclusion of this parameter in the TRE is the need to ensure consistency in the methodology used in benchmarking ammonia and other fertilizer products like urea. CO2 that is consumed in urea processes are typically from industrial process emissions, which is the reason why these methods have been included in this chapter. The method provided here is based on a stoichiometric ratio of CO2 generated to the urea that is produced. Industrial process CO2 emissions are also generated from the calcination of carbonates. Methods used to quantify these emissions include CO2 from calcinating calcium and magnesium carbonates, and CO2 from calcining carbonates in pulp mills. Similar to the methods presented in the previous slide, there are also methodologies for IPCO2 emissions generated from the use of carbonates. The carbonate consumption method is a level 1 method, which is the same as the method used for calcining carbonates in pulp mills. The level 3 method relies on a carbonate mass balance approach. And the level 4 method is based on a measured CO2 emission factor. Industrial process CO2 emissions are also generated from the production of ethylene oxide production. The methodology presented for this process is based on a mass balance approach that uses the quantity of ethylene in the feed, ethylene that is lost, and the quantity of ethylene oxide that is produced. And lastly, there are IPCO2 emissions that are generated from the use of carbon as a reductant. This method is based on the mass of carbon that is converted to CO2. Nitrous oxide emissions generated from nitric acid production are also considered to be industrial process emissions. In the AQM, there are 3 levels of methods that are used to quantify these emissions. Method 8-1 is a level 1 method that uses nitrous oxide emission factor for systems with abatement downtime. Method 8-2 is a level 2 method that is based on a nitrous oxide emission factor developed from measurements collected from stack testing. And finally, SEMS is considered a level 3 method that may be used to quantify the nitrous oxide emissions directly.
This section covered hydrogen and electricity, which are part of the chapter 12 and 13. The overview for this section covered the electricity first, that is all the related data source and import and export. The second part covered hydrogen, that we will talk about imports, exports, but new concepts that we need to introduce that are produce, useful, and waste hydrogen. It will be discussed in the next section when we talk about cogeneration. So with regard to the electricity sector, this table shows the impact that the electricity has under tiers regulation. with regard to the imported amount, exported amount, and generated amount of the electricity, and what that means in terms of the share of the emissions when we apply the HPV for electricity, the 0.37. So we can observe some sector that has an important impact in emissions, another sector that has a medium, another sector is a little bit low. We will not spend too much time on this table. It's just for your reference, understanding the complexity, this regulation with regard to the electricity. The Alberta quantification methodology, the AQM, define the electricity transaction that must be quantified in accordance with the ISO definitions, which means that meter energy means to quantify an electric energy transferred to a point of delivery or a point of supply. That means that the import and export of the electricity should be considered at the point that cross the boundaries of the facility. We have some cases, some deficiencies in the reporting and in the verification, where some facilities report also the station load as imported or exported electricity. Also, it's important to mention that the produced electricity that is exported essentially is the import or export to the grid in Alberta, but also could have that facilities that export or import electricity from other facilities that are close to this facility and not to the grid. For the electricity point of view, it's very important to evaluate this balance. This balance means that import electricity plus generated electricity should be equal to the used plus exported electricity. The imported electrical may be based on custody and transfer, but also in third-party records. That is very important. We can see sometimes some deficiencies in the verification, that verifiers are working basically on the DCS data or databases, internal databases from the facility, when we have more accurate information that we could access to validate the number that has been reported. The important definition with regard to used electricity is that refers to the electricity that is consumed by the facility. In the case of the cogeneration, for example, this used electricity includes the station load. We have had also some deficiencies in the verification process of this used electricity. So moving ahead with regard to the hydrogen, we have a similar table referring the impact of the hydrogen under tiers for the different sectors. We can observe that there are some sectors where the hydrogen, wherever it is imported, exported, or wasted hydrogen, represent an important amount with regard to the share of the emissions. The specific sector that present more vulnerability for the calculation or unreporting and verification of the hydrogens, we could say that is fertilizers, upgraders, oil sand sectors, refining are the most sensitive sectors with regard to the hydrogen. The general requirement for the hydrogen quantification and reporting says that in the AQM, that annual production, import, or export of hydrogen is based on direct measurement, accounting record of sales record with third party. Same concept that we outlined for the electrical and electricity report. Sometimes the facility report based on data from the data system, the databases, DCS, etc. And when are more important records or more accurate records that could be based the report and the verification. there is some important concept with regard to the hydrogen in how it's reported, that sometimes we have hydrogen with some other component, and this other component must be removed in the reporting of the hydrogen. So this kind of impurities or other constituent of the stream must be removed, and the only thing that should be reported is the mass of hydrogen. Similarly than the electricity, we should observe this balance with regard to the hydrogen, which means that imported plus generated should be equal than useful plus exported plus wasted hydrogen. This is a similar balance that we have for electricity, but we have two different concepts here, useful and waste hydrogen. These two concepts are introduced in the tiers regulation and affect basically just one sector or one sector that is using the ABCWE as production for metrics. And that also has not any impact in the compliance report. This concept of useful hydrogen and waste hydrogen affect basically the calculation of the facility-specific benchmark. The definition of useful hydrogen, we could find it in the standards, and means all the hydrogen that has been generated at the facility, but excluding the hydrogen that has been combusted, wherever combustion means, and the hydrogen also that has been vented into the atmosphere. These two things, hydrogen that has been combusted and hydrogen vented to the atmosphere, is what we call the waste hydrogen. Another important concept under tiers with regard to the production of hydrogen is that we are not including just the hydrogen that is generated by the dedicated unit, but also the hydrogen that has been generated as byproduct. But again, we should separate and report just the mass of hydrogen that has been produced. The AQM, as we mentioned before, provide these two equations that helps us to calculate or to maintain the balance. The first equation, the equation 8-6, refers to the balance of the hydrogen. And here is shown in the calculation of the waste, that because usually it's the most difficult calculation, but this equation basically represents a balance of the hydrogen that we need to observe, we need to report, we need to verify. And the second equation, the 8-7, represent the separation of the and the report of the hydrogen from the different constituent of the stream. Facility must report just the hydrogen, the mass of hydrogen that has been generated. That's leave us to the summary of this section, that is electricity on hydrogen. And the summary trying to outline those things that we observe with higher levels or medium level of deficiencies in the reporting and in the verification of the compliance report and the FSV. In red, we can see the topic that we observe with higher level of deficiencies. That is basically the missing data procedures and the standard condition that should be applied before any calculations. In addition, we have other topics that has a medium level of the deficiency. We have observed that is in medium level of deficiency and are pretty common between other sections in the AQM, and are related with the data manipulation, the gathering of the data, the use of different parameters. The AQM set parameters that are mandatory to use, and facilities are not adopting in many cases, those parameters, and we have seen deficiencies in how the verification has been conducted with regard to following the QM. We discussed a little bit with regard to the invoices when we have availability of these records instead of DCS data or data from the database. We are observing still not using weighted average when it is possible to do it. Issues with data reconciliations and data consistency. I mean, negative number where we know that may not happen, or zero number when we know that may not happen. And that's conclude our section with regard to electricity and hydrogen. This section covers cogeneration and heat import and export, which mean from the AQM chapters 16 and partially 12. So the first thing that we need to understand with regard to the cogeneration is the different definitions that we have over the different regulations. Under TIERS regulation, cogeneration typically means the process that implies a combustion engine to power a generator, the exhaust from which is used to produce useful heat for an industrial purpose. So that means that the concept of combustion engine is very key under TIERS regulations with regard to the cogeneration. This table shows the impact that we have in the current sectors with regard to the cogeneration. We have the number of facilities here. We have the generated heat, the electricity that has been generated, and the emissions associated with this steam and electricity when are affected by the HPV for heat and electricity. And the same with regard to the heat and electricity that has been exported, that is for different year, and the emissions associated. It's just for having an idea of the impact of cogeneration in the different sectors. This table is quite interesting too. We will not spend too much time. This column, actual cogeneration emissions, means the emissions that are from the cogeneration from the total reported emissions. As we can see, for example, in the power plant cogeneration, 100%, but in other sectors represent a fraction. Quite interesting to see these two shares of the emissions. It means the heat and the electricity when we are generated and exported by the cogeneration when are affected by the HPV for heat and for electricity. So, and when we add up these two, it's a little bit higher than 100% for the power plant cogenerations, meaning some benefit that we may have for this sector. Quite interesting to see too in the forest product when we can see the effect of the use of the biomass in generating electricity and heat. So for the cogeneration point of view, we should be clear that cogeneration doesn't affect the annual compliance report. The concept of cogeneration affects the FSV for the facilities that need to recalculate the FSV. And the standards for setting the benchmark establish these two equations for the calculation of the FSV for facilities that are not reporting ABCWV as product. The first part is the FSV tightening, and the second one, the not tightening. The first equation, we can see how the cogenerations affect the FSV tightening. And these are the two parameters that are affected or has implication in the FSV calculation. The first one is that we call the EE, which is the emission for the fossil fuels combustions, and the CH4 and N2O from biomass. And those emissions are associated with the self-generation of the electricity. The second parameter that we can see here is that we call E heat used. And these emissions are associated with the co-generated heat and the imported and exported heat. We have the equation here that come from the standard for developing the FSBs, when we can see that this heat used represent three terms: the co-generated heat, import heat, and export of the heat affected by the HPV. And in the case that we are using specified gas emitter regulation data, this co-generated heat could be replaced by the deemed heat that is defined in the specified gas emitter regulation data. So for understanding a little bit more the concept of the co-generation unit and their tiers, we have this diagram that comes from the AQM. This is a generic diagram from a co-generation. The main part from this co-generation is the gas turbine, which is generating some electricity. And then we have the heat recovery steam generator, the HRSG, that supplement the production of heat. So receive some feed water of heat and increment the enthalpy of this heat, producing still more heat that is going to the steam turbine. The steam turbine generates electricity and provides some heat also to the industrial host. Also could be an extraction here that follow the same procedures. So is heat that is going to the industrial host. In addition of that, we may have some stream that is leaving the HRSG and goes directly to the industrial host. That also could be, it's part of the co-generated heat we see in coming slides. We may have a stream also of heat that is coming from industrial host and directly goes to the steam turbine that contribute to the generation of electricity for the steam turbine. And finally, we may have a boiler. The boilers receive also some feed water, increase the enthalpy, produce some steam. Some of this steam could go to the industrial host, and some steam could be used in the steam turbine to generate electricity. Let's see how each one of these parameters and these sources works in our definition of the co-generation variables under the tiers regulation. We have three main components in the co-generation, which is the electricity that has been co-generated, the emissions associated with this generation of the electricity, and the heat generated in the co-generation. The electricity that has been co-generated is quite simple here, so and is showing in red. So we have electricity from the gas turbine and electricity for the steam turbine. The emissions associated with the co-generation or the self-generation of the electricity is a little more interesting. It has three components basically that are the emission for the gas turbine, the emission from the HRSG, and the emissions, a portion of the emission from the boilers, the emission that the boilers contribute in the steam to generate electricity through the steam turbine. And these are the emission from the boiler, the total emission from the boilers, and the ratio between the contribution of the heat from the boiler in the steam turbine divided by the heat that has been produced in the boiler. Finally, the heat that has been co-generated is remarked here in blue, and we can see three components. The first one is the heat that is going to the industrial host, always we need to go to some industrial host that is unregulated facility. And is the heat that is leaving the steam turbine. Again, could be extraction or exhaust of the steam turbine, and is the heat that is going to the industrial host. Then we have a second component that is this one, that is the steam that is leaving the HRSG without to go through the steam turbine, but goes directly from the HRSG to the industrial host. And we need to subtract the heat for balance that is coming into the boundaries of the cogeneration unit that come from the industrial host to the HRSG. That is the definition of the cogenerated heat. In case that we are using data from the specified gas emitter regulations, the emissions from the self-production of the electricity could be replaced by what the specified gas emitter regulations define as GT, and the cogenerated heat could be taken as the dim heat divided by the HPV of the heat. That constitutes some equivalence with regard to the current definitions under the TIR's regulations. So based on that, the AQM outlined 3 different cases. The first one is the one that we have discussed, the generic one, but it's interesting to remark 2 other specific cases. The first one is when we have not boiler. So we have the gas turbine and the steam turbine. So the co-generated electricity, again, is the contribution of both. The emissions from the self-generation of the electricity right now has disappeared the boiler, so it shoots the gas turbine emissions and the HRSG emissions, so simplification of everything. And the heat is maintained the same way, the same definition that before. And that is interesting also to see when we have an integrated cogeneration with boiler. When we have this case, the electricity that has been co-generated is the electricity from the steam turbine, shoots that. The emissions from the self-generation of the electricity, the portion that we have from the boiler, similar than before, for sure. And the interesting thing here is the heat co-generated, it's 0 under TIR's regulation. In the case that we have an integrated cogeneration with boiler, the cogeneration heat is 0 because this heat didn't went over the combustion engine that is defined in the TIR regulation. So as wrapping up of this section from cogeneration and heat, we can outline those deficiencies that we have seen in the verification process in the report, but also in the verification process. And in red are stressed those that are higher level of deficiencies. Because of the cogeneration and heat calculation, when we calculate the similar way, the imported or exported heat, we need a lot of variables. We need pressure, temperature, flows, etc., to calculate the enthalpies. That presents a high level of deficiency in how has been reported and how has been verified. We see a lot of deficiencies in the management of the data, in the validation of the data, in reconciliation of the data, in how it's weighted, the calculations, the use of parameters. There are a significant amount of deficiencies in the reporting and verification of the enthalpies. And associated with that, there are deficiencies in the reporting and verification of the instrument associated with the calculation of the enthalpies, the missing data procedures application when we have some gaps in the data, consistency for the data. We have seen many times negative values, again, or 0 value when we know that may not happen, and so on. In addition, in this case, when we have boilers, similar than in the case that we calculate the CH4 and N2O for stationary fuel combustion, when we have biomass. So there is needed sometime the back calculation of the mass of the biofuels, and we have seen also an important amount of deficiencies in the verifications. Medium level of deficiencies in the verifications, similar to other sections in the AQM. So the calculation of the carbon content, HHB, the use of the mandatory factors and parameters that are written in the AQM, facilities are not using, and verification process are not capturing the not use of the mandatory parameters. The use of the invoices when, for example, when we have import and export of heat, reconciliations, volume, standard conditions to report variables, and so on. And that's conclude our section with regard to cogeneration and heat import and export.
The next section of this training will deal with production, as TIER is an output-based regulatory system. Production is as important to properly quantify as emissions in order to get the correct compliance outcomes. So products that are covered under TIER will have a facility-specific benchmark and/or a high-performance benchmark. Where there is a situation where both benchmarks exist, the larger or more generous of the two benchmarks will be applied for compliance purposes. The regulation itself sets out high-performance benchmarks for products in Schedule 2, and the quantification methodology document further describes the measuring and quantification of some of these products. Products that have only facility-specific benchmarks are not laid out in the regulation itself, nor are they covered in the quantification methodology. Information on the facility-specific benchmarks is supplied to the facility in a letter from the director. Not all facility-specific benchmarks are necessarily set on the product that is sold. It's a potential for there to be facility-specific benchmarks on intermediate products or potentially inputs to the facility. Some products covered by TIER are also regulated or tracked by other organizations. For example, exported electricity is often metered and kept by the Alberta Electrical System Operator. Mine bitumen is covered by the Alberta Energy Regulator in the statistical series ST39. In situ bitumen, similarly covered in ST53. And then also the Alberta Gas Processing Index has a number of inputs that are covered by the AER and captured in Petronex. Following table lays out the facilities that have facility-specific benchmarks or high-performance benchmarks. So this list is dynamic, and we expect it will likely expand somewhat over time as new facilities opt in to the regulation. The sites on this, or the products on this list with the asterisks, denote those sites that have other external information which can be used to corroborate the production figures. Note that industrial heat is also marked in that way, and that's because typically industrial heat has both an exporting party and an importing party, and those two figures can be reconciled. So the regulation, as mentioned, sets out high performance benchmarks. The following table lays out the high performance benchmarks that are currently specified in the regulation. That list could be amended from time to time, and the regulation also sets out that high performance benchmarks can be set by ministerial order um, by the minister at any point in time. So we have, I guess, both a general approach and specific approaches discussed in the quantification methodology. So unless otherwise specified, what we've indicated is that production data can be used. So that would be direct measurements and accounting or third-party sales records. So that excludes refining in situ oil sands and Alberta gas processing index, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then also accounting or sales data with inventory adjustments can also be used for production purposes in the general approach. So when looking at production, it is important, as it is with emissions, to evaluate the evidence on which the production is based. So what is the source of that evidence or the documentation? Is the documentation based on the facility data management system? If it is based on the facility data management system, what is the underlying source of the data in terms of instrumentation or scales or measurement? So have the facility controls been adequately tested in regards to production? And then also, are there accounting records or third-party documentation to confirm quantities sold? So for example, in the case of electricity, there may be third-party records with the Alberta Electrical System Operator for the amount of electricity sent to the grid. So also be careful of black box production accounting. So ensure that there's some transparency or traceability to the production numbers that are presented. I'll talk a little bit about the production unit that's used for refining and upgrading under tier. So there are really three parts to this production unit, and this is the Alberta Complexity Weighted Barrel Unit. So one part is what we call the CWB production, and that basically is related to the throughput of specific refinery or upgrader units times an associated factor that scales the throughput for that type of unit. It also includes a CWB offsite. So this is related to the total input barrels. So this is calculated from the total input barrels, and those total input barrels are defined as all raw material inputs to the refinery, less transfers of raw materials from the refinery. So this is really intended to really kind of correct and normalize the correlation between the CWB metric and emissions at refiners and upgraders. The CWB non-crude really is a scaling of non-crude input barrels, including the total raw material processed by the refinery other than crude or other materials entering the atmospheric distillation unit. So that's the three factors that are combined through equation 1314-18 to calculate the Alberta Complexity Weighted Barrel for refiners or upgraders. So the each individual process unit may have a scaling factor that's used in the calculation of the production CWB, and those are laid out in a table based on the work by Solomon and Associates. So the table sets out the unit of measure. So that's typically barrels per standard day, and the capacity basis. So whether that's the output or the feed to the unit, or a particular product where multiple products are produced by the unit. So also to highlight that the FCCC unit, or the FCC unit, is the typically the largest contributor where that unit is present. And when working with that unit, the percent volume factor that is required is calculated under tier using the Grace-Davison method. So I'll talk a little bit about that that factor. So that volume of coke on catalyst, the calculation has a number of steps. It's not difficult in terms of the math that's applied, but there's a large number of variables that go into the calculation of that percent volume coke on catalyst. The main principles are really related to the gas analysis from the flue gas from the process, as well as an understanding of the air feed into the process and the properties associated with that air feed. The flue gas flow is calculated, and then basically a mass balance is applied, which includes again those gas analysis components from the flue gas, as well as an understanding of the input gas feed, and then that's used to calculate that volume of coke. So coke is calculated, and then coke yield is also derived from this method. And you could apply this method also to calculate the CO2 emissions from the FCC unit. So a lot of variables, care should be taken in making sure that the inputs to this part of the equation are well supported and I guess well quantified. I'll talk a little bit too about the Alberta Gas Processing Index. So this is used at our large emitter or opted-in gas plants for the most part. So it's method 13.1 and 13.2 in the quantification methodology. 13.1 is based on a material balance for the gas plant instead of the direct measurement of specific flows, and that's to accommodate situations where some gas plants, older facilities, potentially don't have all of the required metering to make direct measurement, and so a method based on mass or material balances is supplied. Method 13-2 is intended for use where physical metering is required at the points that are needed in order to quantify the Alberta Gas Processing Index. So a little bit like the complexity weighted barrel, the gas processing index is essentially a throughput measure. So for different types of units, the throughput is multiplied by a scaling factor, and this is then added together in order to get an overall measure. So these scaling factors were, I guess, developed from sector data in terms of typical performance or emissions performance for those units. So the weighting factors are typically in tons CO2e per unit, per throughput unit. And so the resulting Alberta Gas Processing Index is basically a measure that's in tons CO2e related to kind of a standard gas processing facility. And again, the throughputs in many cases are tied to Petronex reporting for those facility types. So the Petronex data should be consulted, I guess, to confirm the correct calculation of the Alberta Gas Processing Index. So again, when looking at production, there's a number of areas that should be examined. We've created a list here where we've highlighted what we see as some of those requirements and the impact if some of those requirements are missed, where I guess the orange color has a medium impact and the red color tends to have a higher impact in terms of accuracy of the resulting production information. So again, third-party data, so the referencing of third-party data where it's available to ensure that that there's a correlation or corroboration of the production evidence presented by the facility. Throughputs and product property calculations, so things related to moisture levels or additives or whatever. So in some cases there's corrections that may be required in order to get to a standardized moisture level. So assurance that those conversions have been done and done properly. Tracing down and looking at consistency of factors, parameters, and constants, and the support for those figures. The cross-referencing against invoices. The potential for, I guess, missing data procedures, the use of weighted averages where that's applied in order to come up with production figures, the consistency of the data that is used over the course of the calculation, and then reconciliations that may be required. So this might have to do with inventory adjustments or other kinds of reconciliations. And then also very important is where production is measured at volume, that the correct standard conditions have been applied in calculating production.
Biomass CO2 emissions are CO2 emitted from decomposition, fermentation, or combustion of biomass. In this chapter, the methodologies are specifically for CO2 from the combustion of biomass. We anticipate posting other chapters to provide methodologies for fermentation and decomposition at a later date. Biomass CO2 is not included in a facility's direct emissions, meaning that biomass CO2 does not impact a regulated facility's compliance obligation. Therefore, the level classification for quantifying biomass CO2 is 1, as defined in the standard for completing greenhouse gas and forecasting reports. This allows facilities to use a less stringent methodology to quantify these emissions. However, it is noted that methane and nitrous oxide emissions from biomass combustion are considered to be stationary fuel combustion emissions, and therefore the methods for methane and nitrous oxide are specified in Chapter 1, where stationary fuel combustion methodologies are prescribed. In general, biomass CO2 emissions are mostly emitted in the forestry, food processing, and waste, i.e. landfill sectors. In the next few slides, we'll provide a quick overview of the methodologies in this chapter. For level 1, the methodology requires the use of default emission factors for various types of biomass fuels, such as ethanol, biodiesel, wood fuels or waste, and various types of spent pulping liquor. The emission factors are provided in Table 14-1 in this chapter. The level 3 methodology is more rigorous as it requires measurements of the carbon content in the fuel. As discussed earlier, a regulated facility does not need to apply a level 3 method to quantify biomass CO2 emissions. However, if it is selected, the facility would have to ensure that the requirements of the methodology are met. Under the requirements section, we have highlighted areas where there are common deficiencies in the quantification of these emissions and also verification of these various factors. A facility may also choose to apply continuous emissions monitoring system, SEMS approach, to quantify biomass CO2 emissions. As discussed in the overview of the stationary fuel combustion chapter, this approach is not preferable as there are limitations on its accuracy. However, there are some facilities that are unable to accurately measure the quantity of the fuel or the carbon content, and SEMS is an alternative approach that can be applied. In the case of biomass CO2, again, facilities may use a default emission factor methodology that is described under level 1. We also have facilities, especially in the forestry sector, that combust a mixture of biomass fuels and fossil fuels to generate steam. In this section, we do provide a methodology to back calculate the quantity of biomass portion in the mixed fuel based on parameters such as the enthalpy of steam that is generated, efficiency of the boilers based on biomass to energy or mixed fuel to energy, heat inputs, and high heating values of the biomass fuel.
We'll now spend a bit of time talking about requirements that are specific to aggregate facilities. So, as we mentioned in the regulatory overview, aggregates are a new concept under tier, and aggregates are really a collection or aggregation of 2 or more conventional oil and gas facilities that are brought together for reporting and benchmarking purposes under tier. So a conventional oil and gas facility may contain several sites that are adjacent or connected by a pipeline network that operate in an integrated fashion. And in that sense, a conventional oil and gas facility could contain a number of what are considered Petronex facilities and Petronex facility IDs. So aggregate facilities are regulated for stationary fuel combustion emissions only. So that does include emissions from well drilling or well completion activities. Quantification methodologies do rely heavily on Petronex reported data, both fuel consumption as well as production data. So we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. So like the other methods in the quantification methodology requirements, the methods are provided and they're separated by levels, and the various levels in this case apply for aggregate facilities. So for fuel consumption, there are a couple of different levels and 3 different methods supplied. The method 15.1 really touches on a single gas stream approach, whereas methods 15.2 and 15.3 cover the cases where you may have multiple gas streams and where you're also accounting for third-party supplied fuels such as diesel and propane. And then once you have looked at the fuel consumption, then the next step would be to use that information in calculating carbon dioxide emissions. And there are a few different approaches here. So 15.4 lays out the application of a single CO2 emissions factor for the Petronex reported fuel. 15.5 speaks to those third-party purchased fuels that are non-variable fuels, again, such as gasoline, diesel, propane. And then 15.6, 15.7 get into looking at multiple gas stream approach, where there is some measured attributes of the gas that are available in order to develop a more accurate CO2 emissions factor. So methane nitrous oxide emissions are done by emissions factor, and really there's sort of three categories here. Again, we have a treatment for the non-variable fuels, gasoline, diesel, propane, etc. There's also a sector-based set of factors that we can use for the variable fuels. And we've also made available technology-based emissions factors in order to have a pathway to recognize changes or improvements in combustion technology at the site, which may reduce methane or nitrous oxide emissions. And then for production, really we're looking at a variety of potential Petronex production volumes, which could be used to define the production for the aggregate facility. So we'll step through some of those sections in a little bit more detail. So on the fuel consumption, again, method one is looking at a single stream approach. So it assumes one fuel type is consumed at the conventional oil and gas facility. And then sites may sum the fuel consumed by each of the conventional oil and gas facilities using the data that's fuel consumption that's reported in Petronex, and then apply emissions factors to that fuel total. So method two is looking at multiple fuel gas streams. So this is where you're applying a measured higher heating value or gas analysis. So really the two elements that are important here is there needs to be some identification of which streams are which. So there has to be some, if you will, professional judgment in terms of saying this is a gas stream. It could be that there's a single gas stream at a conventional oil and gas facility. It could be that a conventional oil and gas facility has a couple of different fuel gas streams that are quite different in composition and need to be considered as separate streams. For the application of this method, there is a quarterly gas sampling requirement in order to have measurement of either the higher heating value or the gas composition. So the third method is fuel consumed based on internal facility or third-party metered volumes. So this would typically be speaking to fuels not reported in Petronex. There could be some fuel gases in that category, but more typically this would be non-variable fuels like propane, diesel, or gasoline that are purchased and brought onto the site. And again, for those non-variable fuel types, default emissions factors are provided. So that brings us, I think, into the calculation of CO2. So method 4 sets out emissions factors for a default fuel composition. And for that purpose, we're taking a rich gas composition. And so that's based on 80% methane fuel type. And the default emissions factor is then multiplied by the fuel volume as reported in Petronex. So generally, one of the things we're looking for is for the same methodology to be applied for benchmarking and compliance reporting. So in the case where folks would like to apply gas compositions or higher heating values for compliance reporting, but don't have that data for benchmarking, or are looking to change their method from using default emissions factors to gas compositions or higher heating values for compliance reporting, but again don't have that benchmarking data. We have supplied a sales gas composition, which could then be used to correct the benchmark setting in order to provide a conservative benchmark where those methodologies are being changed from benchmarking to compliance period. And that sales gas composition is based on a 98% methane content. So for method 5, we're really looking at the non-variable fuels. And so we've provided a table of CO2 emissions factors to apply when looking at non-variable fuels. And again, really, these are fuel volumes which are calculated in many cases by third-party invoices or third-party metering, but internal metering could be used also, for example, where a quantity of fuel is purchased and only a portion of that invoice is consumed within the aggregate. So method 6 sets out the calculation of CO2 based on correlations with higher heating value of gaseous fuels. So this method is consistent with the federal greenhouse gas reporting program method, and that's the basis of the correlation that we're using in this case. So the method does require measured higher heating values for fuels, which needs to be collected on a quarterly basis if you're applying this method. And the use of fuel volumes in this case is expected to be from internal facility metering or potentially third-party metering or invoices if this fuel gas is being purchased from another party. Method 7 basically sets out CO2 emissions based on measured carbon content of the fuel gas being consumed. So this is, I guess, a further refinement of the higher heating value method. If both higher heating value and gas composition are available, this method 7, it would be the preferred method to apply since it's more accurate. So again, this essentially calculates the carbon content of the fuel and scales that by the fuel volume as well as the molar mass of the CO2. This could also be applied for liquid fuels. So again, in this case, you're applying a slightly different equation that involves the volume of the fuel and the fraction of the carbon content against that volume. So for methane and nitrous oxide emissions, really we're providing all of these methods are emissions factors based, but we're providing, I guess, 3 different tables of factors. So again, one set of factors for non-variable fuels, those would again primarily be gasoline, diesel, propane. And another method is providing factors based on sector numbers for variable fuels. And so this doesn't get into equipment specifics, but it's a broad set of defaults for the sector. And then method 10 is really where we get into the equipment-based emissions factors. So again, when looking at the equipment-based emissions factors, obviously one important item to recall or to consider as part of the verification is the methodology and robustness of the methodology used to split up fuel use by equipment type. So that should definitely be considered when looking at applications of method 10. Okay, so some of the things to consider when looking at the selection of which set of factors to apply. So again, you may apply one of sector-based or equipment-based emissions factors within a COG. So the intent is that for a particular conventional oil and gas facility, you're either using equipment-based factors or sector-based factors and not mixing them within a single conventional oil and gas facility. The expectation, again, also is that the same method is being applied for each COG in benchmarking and in compliance reporting. And again, if equipment-based emissions factors are selected, different equipment-based emissions factors can be used between the benchmarking and compliance report to reflect changes in the equipment that's present at the COG. So again, the idea here is that the equipment-based emissions factors allows a reflection of the evolution of the equipment in place at the facility over time. So we'll turn our attention now to the benchmark and the benchmark unit. So again, TIER is a output-based pricing system, and the production of the aggregate is a very important factor in the calculation of the compliance outcomes for the aggregate. We have provided some flexibility in the output metric that can be selected, if you will, the production for the aggregate. And that's what we're referring to really by the benchmark unit. We're saying what is the unit of measure for the production of the aggregate, and how is that calculated? So again, a number of options have been made available. So we provided a kind of a grouping, what we call option 1, of 3 very common types of production which can be applied. So that would be what's reported in Petronex as production in meters cubed oil equivalent, or what's reported in Petronex as disposition in meters cubed oil equivalent, or what's provided through Petronex or reported through Petronex as receipts in meters cubed oil equivalent. So a large number of aggregates will be using one of those 3 options that are under option 1. Option 2 is a different methodology that is allowed for aggregates to develop the benchmark unit. And so this is really based on a correlation method. So it identifies 1 or more production accounting metrics from a possible total of 15 accounting metrics that are reported in Petronex that produces the best linear relationship with the aggregate's emissions. So once the aggregate has identified that best correlation, they would submit that as an application to us, and we'd review and accept that metric. That would be a little bit like some of our other, like for example, our Alberta Gas Processing Index, in that it would be a weighting, a potential weighting of 1 or more of those accounting metrics to form the production for the facility. More information on this approach is given in section 15.4 of the quantification methodology. when we're looking at the evaluation of benchmark units, we're really looking at three kind of indicators that we're evaluating when we're looking at the various options under or the various choices that are available under option 1. So one of those indicators that we're looking at is kind of strong month-to-month correlation between the requested unit and the aggregate's facility emissions. And we're looking at that, I guess, as a proxy for the potential for strong correlation over years between that production metric and the facility emissions. So we're also looking at which production metric potentially minimizes the variability of emissions intensities, the monthly emissions intensities over the course of a year. So we're curious to see if a particular production metric can reduce that variability month by month. And again, this is a bit of a proxy for the potential variability year over year from a production metric. And that variability year over year could obviously create swings in compliance outcomes. And we're also looking for something that reasonably represents the composition and operation of the conventional oil and gas facilities that make up the aggregate. So we're also looking, if you will, for a unit that makes sense given the primary business of the aggregate. So benchmark units may be requested by the person responsible for an aggregate. And that process is ongoing as we speak. Just to highlight that the default approach that we're taking for aggregates is that we're using what we call a same year benchmark for 2020, in that most aggregates will be comparing their 2020 performance essentially to itself, and that was a simplification that we developed for the 2020 year for aggregates. Some aggregates will be requesting a 2019 benchmarking period where they have made some significant changes at their facility to reduce emissions intensity from the 2019 year. So again, those folks that are using 2020 as their reference are really just asking for the confirmation of the benchmark unit. They're not setting a historic intensity at this point in time. So when they submit that request for a benchmark unit, we'll approve that in a letter for the department, as well as the I guess the method to calculate the benchmark reference for use in 2020. If a benchmark unit application is not received from an aggregate facility, the department will do that assignment of a benchmark unit based on our internal analysis.
Since we do not prescribe methodologies for all sources and parameters reported under the regulation, facilities are required to apply a methodology for these sources that would be reasonable and or conservative. Typically, methods that are used under SGER or CCIR would be acceptable. As well, methods for the same or similar sources published in another industry accepted standard, such as methodologies published by the IPCC, USAPA, WCI, and API would be acceptable. In some cases, facilities may have direct measurements that can be used. Ultimately, the method selection relies heavily on the facility's knowledge of their own process operations and sources, and facilities must be able to demonstrate to the verifier the reasoning for the methods that are selected. From a verification point of view, without prescribed mandatory quantification methodologies, there is a reliance on the verifier's knowledge and experience in the particular sector, process operations, or sources in evaluating whether the methodology is reasonable and conservative. This again points to the importance of making sure that team members in a verification team have the specific experience in the subject area and are able to provide expertise when assessing a facility's or a project assertion. In cases where it is challenging to assess whether a methodology for a source or parameter is reasonable, assessing for conservativeness would be important. When we speak of conservativeness, we have to consider whether the methodology is being applied for compliance reporting or benchmarking. For example, emissions quantified for compliance reporting would need to be conservatively high, while emissions quantified for benchmarking would need to be conservatively low. Also, in many cases where there are no applicable mandatory methodologies, the emissions being quantified may be considered to be negligible, which we will discuss further in the next section. Negligible emissions are the total emissions that represent less than 1% of the total regulated emissions, or allowable emissions up to a maximum of 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. These emissions could represent emissions from one source category or the aggregate of emissions from several categories. Please note that 1% up to 10,000 tons represents the total negligible emissions for the facility and not 1% of emissions from individual source categories. A facility may use an alternative quantification methodology to assess negligibility and to report these emissions as well. If the facility uses an alternative quantification methodology, they must demonstrate that the method is conservative. So for example, if a facility has stationary fuel combustion emissions from small heaters, they may be estimated by the number of heaters, maximum fuel consumption rate, and maximum operating hours. Perhaps for conservativeness, the facility may choose to add an additional factor to the number of estimated heaters to ensure that it is conservative. The facility must document the methodology and assumptions used in the quantification methodology document. It is the verifier's role to assess whether the alternative methodology applied is conservative, while considering what is conservative from a benchmarking or compliance reporting perspective. Here are some general considerations and checks when verifying quantification methodologies. First, determine what mandatory quantification methodologies apply to the facility that you're verifying. Here you would need to refer to the compliance or the benchmark standards and the AQM to make that determination. Second, are the verification procedures adequate enough to determine whether the facility is applying the methodologies correctly? Did the facility request any deviations for mandatory quantification methodologies? And if so, were approvals granted by the department? Lastly, did the facility complete a quantification methodologies document that meets the requirements outlined in the compliance standard? This is an important document for both the verifier and the department to review to ensure that compliance is met with the mandatory quantification methodologies. In this section, we want to discuss some of the areas that could be improved in the verification process. We encourage verifiers to review the regulation and standards to understand the criteria for benchmarking, compliance reporting, emission offset projects, and other types of submissions. Given the frequency of changes in the regulation, having an understanding of the regulation is vital to the success of the verification. As a department, we will continue to engage verifiers and stakeholders to communicate the requirements and expectations for reporting and verifications. And of course, please continue to reach out to the department with any questions and comments. So now we're going to jump into some of the common areas that are often missed or not fully reviewed in verifications. So the review of source data used for facility or project assertions are often missed in verifications. Often what we see is there is a huge reliance on the data outputs from a facility or project data management system without really fully testing the facility's controls. For example, did the verifier trace the facility data back to the source data, such as third-party invoices, actual metered data, or source records? We often discover in our own internal reviews or government re-verifications that facility data management systems often have internal default factors or calculations used to convert source data. Without checking further to identify the source of the data, it is impossible to know what calculations or conversions have been programmed into the facility's data management system. Another form of an assessment that is often missed is assessing the data that is possibly regulated by another organization. For example, electricity data that's reported to the Alberta Electric System Operator, or AESO, fuel consumption and production data reported in Petronex, and production data reported to the Alberta Energy Regulator. We've often find that there are discrepancies in what was reported through these organizations versus what is reported under our regulation. In some cases, there are reasons for the discrepancy, but the assessment has to be conducted first to make that determination. Checking that the facility has applied the mandatory sampling frequencies and whether the application of the missing data procedures were correct is occasionally missed in verifications. Sampling frequencies for fuels, feeds, and other parameters are provided in Table 17-1, while Section 17.5.2 provides the missing data procedures. Along with checking that the facility has applied the minimum sampling frequency, it is important to check that the weighted averages of various different types of parameters, such as carbon content or high heating values, are calculated correctly. When calculating the weighted average, the facility should apply the higher sampling frequency, even if it's greater than the sampling frequencies that are prescribed in Table 17-1. When assessing volumes and flow rates, it is important to ensure that the volumes are compensated to the correct standard temperature and pressure before applying these in certain methodologies. These standard temperatures and pressures are provided in Appendix C, Chapter 13, and other parts of the AQM. As well, reviewing code generation calculations is particularly important from a benchmarking perspective. As discussed previously, the treatment of code generation has been changed between different regulatory regimes. And so it's important to understand the requirements for benchmarking as it relates to code generation emissions. As well, we have published requirements in Chapter 16 to describe code generation calculations. So we encourage verifiers to review these requirements and also the benchmark standard before verifying facilities with cogeneration or self-generation of electricity. We have also found occasionally that incorrect conversion factors, constants, and field properties are not applied properly. Please note that these factors used in the AQM are provided in Appendix B, field properties, and Appendix D, conversion factors. Reviewing the gas composition and high heating values and how it's applied in calculations are not always reviewed adequately. In particular, checking that the gas compositions are normalized, the CO2 in the gas compositions are taken into account, and that weighted average has been applied correctly is important. Also, not as significant, but we have identified that raw data is sometimes not reviewed fully to address things like negative values or faulty data that may be required to be removed from the data set. As well, enthalpy calculations that assume fixed pressures and temperatures and not relying on actual measured data. Trending analysis is a tool that is not often used to identify potential issues. It is a method that could be used to identify issues that may be missed otherwise. So this is an encouraged tool for verifications. A major issue that we talked a little bit earlier about is the lack of verification in facility black box approach in calculating certain reported data like emissions or production. Again, we caution the acceptance of data outputs from facility or project data management systems without adequately testing the facility's controls. Again, we often find that there are hidden calculations, factors, or constants that are applied in these data management systems that are not reviewed in the verification process. A commonly missed or under-reviewed item is the hydrogen production, specifically as it relates to the ABCWB. It is important for the verifier to review the metering, potential recirculated hydrogen, and impurities in the hydrogen that should be excluded. Lastly, the following few items that are less impactful but are often missed in the review, such as fuel consumption estimation, proration of measured fuel usage to individual devices, allocation of electricity generated from multiple suppliers, incorrect rounding of certain parameters or calculated values, and the assessment of negligible emissions. In the next few slides, we will review some of the areas that are missed for verifications of emission offset project reports. The offset project plan and offset project report should be part of the verification criteria, and these are often not reviewed and listed as a criteria. The relevant criteria for the verification of offset project reports are the rules and the regulations that are in place at the time of serialization. If there are changes or variances from the offset project plan to the offset project report, these should be identified and evaluated by the verifier. Verification reports should outline and describe what was reviewed as part of the verification and provide sufficient details on the findings in the verification report. The verifier doesn't always verify if deviation conditions are met. Again, this should be included as part of the criteria of the verification. The verifier should also provide reasoning on whether they agree or disagree with the project developer's selection and review of sources and sinks and how they meet the protocol requirements. And finally, please note that each verification should have its own verification plan and not one verification plan for several reporting periods or several different offset projects that are managed by one project developer.